But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Losing time, I'm fading fast. I just wanna make it last. Try to let go of the past. I close my eyes, embrace the blast. Sleepless nights and headaches stack. Restlessness to hell and back. What's my purpose? What do I grab? A slippery surface, a heart attack. And sometimes you just gotta believe there's something.
There's something strange about me. Sometimes I don't know what I've done or what I said. About Gogh, for instance, what happened right before he left. We had some fights. Maybe I hurt him. I don't know how. I do know that I took a razor and I cut off one of my ears, yes. I cut it off one of my ears, blood all over the place. No one else did it, I did it. I wanted to give it to Gogh with my apologies. Why? God knows.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. You just heard Willem Dafoe giving his interpretation of the ear incident. Of course, Willem Dafoe's interpretation is also Julian Schnabel's interpretation. It's the interpretation you get at Eternity's Gate. Personally, I don't know whether filmmakers and actors should be involved in historical and investigative aspects. And I'll give an example. Peter Jackson was someone who took on the West Memphis 3 case with Damien Eccles. According to this director from New Zealand, with a lot of resources, he was of the opinion that Eccles was unfairly targeted because he wore black and he was weird. I don't think that's very sophisticated effort at investigating something that's a bit more nuanced than that. When we're talking about the ear incident, we are talking about a crime. We're talking about investigating a crime 130 years after the fact. Van Gogh was actually arrested over the ear incident. The police were called, and he was subsequently thrown out of the town because people were led to believe that he was a danger to society. So in this episode, I'm going to try to fairly quickly and simply explicate the True Crime Rocket Science version of the ear incident. And we begin this exploration by asking a very simple question. And often it's the simplest question that's the hardest to answer. And the question is, how do you depict loneliness? So I think Schnabel answered that question and did so very well when he sort of executed that brilliant opening scene of Van Gogh painting his shoes in his room. But I don't think that was what he's trying to do. I don't think he was really trying to depict loneliness in that scene. I think he was trying to depict the way Van Gogh sees the world and the way that he can, the way that he was sort of an enterprising soul. And I think he was trying to depict hardship and perhaps suffering through that scene. But I don't think he was trying to depict loneliness there. And so to answer the question, how do you depict loneliness? I guess the full question is, how do you depict loneliness on screen? How do you visualize it? How do you render it? And At Eternity's Gate and Lust for Life both did it in exactly the same way, which is through glancing up at the heavens, gnashing of teeth, looking as though you're about to cry. And I don't think that is how lonely people experience loneliness. I don't think they stare into mirrors and gnash their teeth, and I think it's inward. I think one of the most obvious outward symptoms of how a lot of people cope with loneliness is through substance abuse. And that is exactly what Vincent van Gogh did. He was a big abuser of absinthe, which is the same, it's kind of like even more, got an even stronger alcoholic content than whiskey. It's something like 60 to 70% alcohol. And it was so bad that it was so implicated in violent acts of violence that it was eventually banned from Europe and European countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even France, between the early 20th century and around about 1916. So around about 20 years after Van Gogh's death, they prohibited the use of absinthe. I've addressed the absinthe aspect in some detail on Patreon in a post titled Van Gogh was arrested over the ear incident, so you can check that out if you're interested. What I want to do here is talk a little bit about the clip that I've played, where you hear Willem Dafoe representing Van Gogh, and in that clip he's actually talking to Dr. Ray, the guy who did the sketch of his ear and the guy who treated him in the hospital in Arles for, the blood loss and the amputation of his ear. In terms of true crime, there are quite a few elements you want to address in terms of this. I'm not going to address those in this video. I did in the Patreon post. What I am going to do in this video is deal with a few logical issues. And the first one is the actor obviously reading from a script, but obviously the script is based on a view, the director's view, the vision for the film, the vision for Van Gogh, the whole idea. And at times I kind of got the idea that Schnabel just wanted to cobble together a film, but apparently it was a lifelong dream of his, so apparently he'd been thinking about it for some time. I really didn't get that sense watching the film. I didn't get the sense that this was a very well thought out film at all. From a true crime perspective, I didn't get the feeling he'd worked anything out. And so here's an example of that. In the dramatization, you see Willem Dafoe kind of saying, I cut off my ear. It was me. No one else did that. And that is simply not accurate. Van Gogh never said, I did that, I cut off my ear. He never actually used those words, which is kind of ridiculous. You'd think, wow, why wouldn't he? If he cut off his ear, why wouldn't he? Right? In all of his letters, he never says, I cut off my ear. And so if you go to the literature and you want to find out what does Van Gogh say about this, well, it's quite clear. He has no memory of the incident. That's his position. Now, just by focusing on that aspect, you can see how there can be a scenario of intoxication explaining a lot of what happened. So on the one hand, you can say Van Gogh cut off his ear because he was intoxicated. Or in another way of putting it, Van Gogh's madness or his irrationality was as a result of being intoxicated. Right? That's one explanation. It's not one that I subscribe to, but it's certainly one possibility. Do you agree? The other possibility is that Van Gogh was intoxicated, and as a result of him being very uninhibited and perhaps acting crazy or in a way that was offensive or whatever, it caused someone to lash out at him. That's another interpretation. If we revert to the first one and you say this guy was so intoxicated that he cut off his ear, you've got to bear the following in mind. You don't just cut off your ear in one little swipe, like cutting off your fingernail. It is something that needs to be sawn off, especially if you're doing it yourself. So you're telling me someone who's intoxicated isn't going to kind of awaken or be sort of snapped out of that malaise by the pain, the searing pain, interrupting that fog. You're telling me that's not going to happen. That's not going to awaken them out of their sort of amnesia of what's kind of happening. And I'm going to deal with the mechanics of cutting off the ear a little bit later in this episode. I first want to deal a little bit more with the dynamics between Van Gogh and Gogh. Now, there are a couple of ways to depict the dynamics. You can have an actor acting the role of Vincent and an actor acting the role of Paul, walking around together and sort of communing with one another in nature. And you can say that is depicting their relationship. For what it's worth, I think At Eternity's Gate did this part fairly well. I mean, it was certainly interesting to think about it in that sense. I didn't really think about them gallivanting sort of in the countryside together at all. I saw them more drinking in bars and cavorting together in brothels, and then being together and having conversations and making art together. That's kind of how I saw it. I really didn't see Gogh sort of wandering around the countryside, although undoubtedly that they must have done that occasionally. The thing is, Vincent was a far more industrious walker, and I don't get the feeling that Gogh was someone who would want to walk a lot. So a clever way of illustrating or depicting the difference in these two artists, and what we're trying to get to when we talk about this, is their different personalities, their different identities. We're trying to look at how would they argue with one another based on their approach to art, but also who they were, what kind of people they were, right? There's quite a lot to say in terms of that. There's not really scope in this video to talk about it, to talk about how different Gogh's background was, how privileged it was, how sort of materialistic in a way it was, compared to Van Gogh's, which was kind of the opposite. He was kind of the opposite of a materialist. He was a kind of a naturalist and someone who was more interested in a simple approach to the divine. I would say Gogh's approach to the divine was more cerebral. And you see this difference in their approach. Bear in mind that they both seem to gravitate towards an idea of the divine. They have that in common, but they come at it from totally different perspectives. And we see that perspective kind of writ large when they painted side by side in the Alyscamps. There is a depiction from Van Gogh of the perspective. You sort of see a line of trees heading down this ancient Roman burial ground. It's a very famous and pretty incredible site, a very old site as well. And this is where the artists painted side by side, and you see a totally different rendering of it. In a couple of Van Gogh's renderings of it, it is just what you see is what you get. But at least one of them, he tries to visualize what he's seeing rather than represent what he's seeing. And what that means is you see a scene, but then you reimagine it in a different way. You interpret reality in a different way. You add some inner dimension to reality to infuse it with something. And that's kind of what Van Gogh was doing anyway, but he would take reality and almost put a tapestry of energy over reality, whereas Gogh would see reality and then he would completely reinvent it, using the same foundation, but giving it a completely different vibe and a different attitude, if that's the way to put it. If that's not giving you a clear sense of how these artists were different, what will give you a clear sense is if you actually look at the physical canvases and the physical paint. You can see when Van Gogh painted something, he painted it incredibly rapidly with very rapid brush strokes. And this is something that David Hockney talks about, just why Van Gogh is such a delightful and inspiring and full of life artist. He was, when he painted, you could feel the joy on his canvases. You could feel the energy and the life sort of you could actually see it in those brush strokes, which were intentionally left behind. The whole idea was that you could see what he was trying to say. It was part of the paint, part of the way that he painted was to express how he was painting it. So in a way it was like a sculpture. And this is something that is addressed in At Eternity's Gate, where the Gogh character says, that's, what you're doing, there's so much paint that you're using, it's like you're sculpting with it. And there definitely is a interesting scene in Eternity's Gate where Van Gogh visits an art museum and he references the artists that he really respects that do paint quickly. And he talks about them executing their art kind of in one sort of flourish, right? Gogh did it completely differently. So Van Gogh on site would start and finish a painting. So literally, pretty quickly he would get it all done. Whereas Gogh would go on site, more often than not he wouldn't even go on site, but if he went on site he would start the broad strokes of what he meant to do, and then he would come home and over possibly a period of days he would complete what he was trying to do. And obviously over that period of time he would think about what he was doing. It would be quite a cognitive process. It would be quite a well thought out idea that he was bringing fruition to. And in this sense, just in terms of pace, you had a very big conflict between these two artists. The one artist was very productive and very fast and very almost casual and reckless in the way he was slapping paint onto the canvas, except it wasn't. It's still very well executed. There's still a lot of balance and proportion to what he's doing. He's still capturing something specific and something unique, some unique interpretation in this gesture, in this sort of flourish. Gogh's doing the same thing, but it's a little bit deeper, I guess, in a way. And so in this sense, they have this this conflict. Van Gogh wants to paint outside in the open air, and he wants to do it sort of frenetically with a lot of energy. Gogh wants to think before he applies his brush to the canvas. He wants to think before he does something. He's very careful. I've been to the Alyscamps, and it is quite a compelling environment. The alley of trees is quite picturesque, but there's sort of a mausoleum at the end of it, and there is a sense of it being extremely old. And so there's a beautiful scene inside this mausoleum where you see Gogh and Van Gogh talking just about how they're doing things differently. That's done quite well. They've Schnabel has chosen the right location for that, and that's sort of executed quite well. And then they talk about their different approaches and why Van Gogh does things the way that he does. And then Gogh kind of says to him, I can't stay here anymore. I need to get out of here. And Van Gogh is devastated by this. And the Gogh character is quite kind. He sort of, is wondering what is, is trying to meet Van Gogh halfway and trying to soften the blow of what he's about to do. And Van Gogh is devastated, and he sort of rushes out of the mausoleum and is in an area of, it's kind of like a labyrinth. And there he sort of looks up into the air, and this is the moment you kind of have this dramatization similar to in Lust for Life, this sort of gnashing of teeth, the madness and all that kind of thing. I get what he's doing, and it works in terms of the film. I just don't think it's anything like what actually happened. I think the arguments would have been far more personal. I think there would have been perhaps pushing and shoving. I think there would have been drink and women. I think it would have been a lot messier, and not just one argument. I think there would have been a lot of snipes and things. I think there would have been just two totally different personalities, totally different approaches to time and cleanliness and money and women, and certainly each other. And so by the end of it, I think they really didn't like each other. I think especially Gogh was fed up with Van Gogh. I don't think so much Van Gogh was fed up with Gogh because he continued writing to him. But I think Gogh was fed up with Van Gogh, as so many people who knew him did become fed up with him. And I think that says it all. In the clip I played at the beginning, you hear Van Gogh saying something like, God knows why I cut off my ear. And there's an extended version where Dr. Ray says, well, what are you trying to do? Like, did you think by giving him your ear, you're going to get him to stay? And of course, in the schema of what happened, it didn't work because he left. So if that was the purpose, if the purpose was cutting off his ear would get Gogh to stay, well, that isn't what happened. He didn't stay. He didn't say, wow, I'm shocked by how distressed you are. I feel so sorry for you. I've changed my mind. I'm going to stay until you're better. And by the same token, when Theo came to kind of pick up Gogh, who was basically his patron, he didn't have much sympathy for Vincent either. And that's the other side of the argument, is if Theo was so sure that Vincent was having kind of a mental breakdown and all that kind of thing, why didn't he stick around? Theo had come all the way down from Paris the next day to fetch Gogh, not to attend to his brother. And so what is that telling you? To me, it says to me, Theo and Van Gogh had a falling out before as well. where Theo described him as very selfish at times, almost having two faces. At times very good-natured, and other times very selfish. And impossible to live with. And that is someone who is like an alcoholic or addicted to something. They are nice at times, and then at other times they are impossible. They are reckless, and they are unreliable, and all that kind of thing. And we know that Van Gogh was at a time addicted to absinthe, and then also that he stopped using it entirely. But that doesn't mean that he couldn't have had a relapse. I don't like the way Gogh is depicted at Eternity's Gate. He's just too nice a guy. He's too accommodating. Whereas the actor, I think it's Anthony Quinn in Lust for Life, I think he's closer to the actual Gogh. In other words, quite rough around the edges, quite brusque and abrasive. And so an abrasive sort of guy, a confrontational sort of guy, would be more likely to lash out at someone who he's fed up with. And things obviously came to a head on the 23rd. It was also the day that Theo announced his engagement. So a lot was happening on that particular date, which I talk a little bit about in the post on Patreon. We get kind of a clearer idea of how Gogh saw Van Gogh in his painting of Van Gogh, which I've spoken about previously on this channel, and we get the same thing from Van Gogh's depiction of Gogh. I'm not going to talk about that here, except that also shows that there was a little bit of ill feeling between them, even though they were caught in a relationship of convenience in terms of Theo was looking after Gogh, and Gogh was kind of helping resurrect Vincent van Gogh's reputation, by the less successful artist rubbing shoulders with the more successful artist. There was a chance for Van Gogh to sort of lift up his reputation. And he was lonely. He wanted some company. But think about this in the dynamic of a relationship that's long past its sell-by date. You have a man and a woman, let's say, and they have been together too long. And one of them has decided quite a long time ago they're done, but they still stay together. And then you kind of have a point where the one decides they're going to leave, and the other one says, I don't want you to go, please don't go, and sort of holds on to them, right? I've seen this happen, I'm sure many of you have as well, where one person is more emotionally dependent or more vulnerable in a way, and the other is wanting to withdraw. And then you have this sort of thing of, please don't go, please don't leave me. But they're actually preventing the person from going. And you see that depicted in Lust for Life, where Kirk Douglas's Van Gogh actually blocks the door, right? And in a situation like that, if you aggravate someone enough and they are fed up enough, they may lash out at you. They may be aggravated enough where they may lash out at you. And that is how I think this ear incident happened, is with possibly two intoxicated artists going at each other. And I believe in this situation, Gogh actually reached for a sword that he had, because he did have a sword, and he refers to that in one of his letters, or someone does. One or the other, Van Gogh or Gogh, refers to a sword in one of the letters. But we know that Gogh was a fencer, and he slashed off Vincent's ear, maybe trying to get him away from the door, or maybe trying to just get him out of his face, and maybe it was accidental, but nevertheless that's how I think it happened. And this is where we get to the mechanics of it, is we talk about what is more likely? Someone sawing off their ear with a razor, but a clean slice off, as Dr. Ray said, or a sword stroke slicing off the ear. Now bear in mind, some ears are tucked slightly behind the head or even right against the head. So if you had to slice down, you would have to slice really close to the skull to actually hit it, whereas other people's ears stand out somewhat. And you can look at self-portraits of Van Gogh to get a sense of how much do his ears stand out, right? Because that's going to give you a sense of, is the sword scenario more likely, just from a practical execution perspective. And now we're going into the sort of true crime rocket science area where we start to investigate the actual act that we're trying to decide between. We're trying to decide between, was the ear sawed off with a razor or was the ear sliced off? Which one is more likely? And you can go to the mechanics of it, and you can look at the, how sharp a razor needs to be and how long it needs to be, and compare that to a sword or whatever, and how quickly one could potentially saw off an ear. But there's the other aspect, which is something that is far easier to establish, and that's when you go and look at the anatomy of a human being, and you go and look at the structure of the ear in terms of things like the blood vessels and arteries around the ear. And when you pay attention to that, you notice something specific. You notice the superficial temporal artery, which is basically a vessel channeling blood around the area of the ear. And it's quite a major artery. It's not a insignificant vessel. And so when you consider that, when you start cutting, bear in mind, this is kind of intuitive. We're intuiting that the ear was cut from the top down, not from the bottom up, right? That is how one would imagine it. But in any event, let's assume that that's true. If that is true, it would mean you are going to start by cutting through this artery. And we know that there was a heck of a lot of blood shed. Just the witness account that the bed was covered in blood, and also that Van Gogh was near death, kind of confirms what we already know, that most of the ear was severed. It was only the bit at the bottom, the lobe, that wasn't cut off. Some of the literature is the other way around. Some of the literature seems to assume that he just cut off a little piece of his earlobe. But the fact is he cut off the whole ear. And, that's the other part, is you would think if he did just cut off part of his ear, maybe that would be more in line with trying to prove a point to Gogh. But cutting the whole ear off was considerably more difficult to execute. And the reason is because you would start by cutting through this artery. In other words, you'd cut through the artery first, which would lead to a shower of blood, right? And you can imagine if this is a razor, a hand filled with blood, and then just a very messy process trying to cut through the rest. And I don't think it would be possible to cut through the ear and then follow through the rest of the way when you have this incision through the ear at the top, through the artery in the beginning. I don't know if there are too many people capable of doing that. Maybe Hannibal Lecter, but you'd have to be some kind of psychopath to pull that off, or as kind of a Zen master. And I don't think Van Gogh had that ability. I don't think very many people have that ability. And you could say that the absinthe gave him that capacity. I just don't think so. If anything, it would have reduced that capacity, because you are less stable with your hands and less, someone who's drunk isn't capable of performing incisions that are accurate and clean. Does that make sense? I want to finalize this episode by just pointing out something of interest, I think, around this particular incident is in 1889, so shortly after his treatment, Van Gogh painted a portrait of Dr. Felix Ray, and he gave it to him as a gift. And we've previously spoken about, did Van Gogh ever sell any of his paintings? I wouldn't call this a sale of a painting, but I do think it acted in some way as that. Ironically, the doctor didn't really like the depiction of the painting, and instead he used the frame, I think, he used the painting to repair a chicken coop. So possibly using the backing of it or something like that. And then in 2016, the portrait was housed at the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts and estimated to be worth over $50 million. Pretty incredible turn of events there. But you've also got to acknowledge that this is a situation where Van Gogh's supposed to be mad and not in possession of his senses, and yet the doctor discharges him from the hospital quite early on. And not only that, Van Gogh paints the inside of the hospital, paints himself twice, and also paints the doctor. Are you telling me someone who's just had an episode is capable of doing that, and doing that sort of accurately? I've already spent quite a lot of time talking about the symbolism in those self-portraits, the use of green, the green in the eyes. All of that, I think, is very valid. I think Van Gogh was jealous and envious and admiring and kind of obsessed with Gogh. He was jealous in the sense of his success and admiring of him finding his way in the art world. And I think he wanted the same for himself. And in a way, I think he blamed himself for what happened to his ear, even though he didn't do it to himself. But if you're going to say, why didn't Van Gogh accuse Gogh if Gogh did it to him? There is a reason for it. Do you know what that is? I do think the most important point to be explicit about here is Van Gogh never said, I cut off my ear, as dramatized in At Eternity's Gate. And in that sense, I think it's a great disservice to the Van Gogh story. It's trying to bring you to a finish line that doesn't appear in the literature, and that's taking a shortcut. That's a cheap shot. And that is why you need true crime rocket science to navigate through those kinds of subtleties. It's important for us to solve this sort of mystery of Van Gogh's ear, because when we deal with the madness, that's an even harder mystery to solve. And then when you deal with the suicide, that is even harder. So we need to establish a sense of who these people are and what is going on, what is really going on, what is not being acknowledged, what is not explicitly stated, what are the actual dynamics. We need to get a handle on that early on so that by the time we get into the asylum, which is where we are now, bear in mind he's preparing to leave, we've got a good handle on that. And then we have an even better handle when we go to Auvers, which happens in sort of late May. So it's very important that you make up your mind about the ear incident so that you're better able to go to the next level, which, as I say, is even harder. And then from there, an even harder level. So what I want you to do, if you haven't done it already, is apply your mind, read some of the articles that I've posted, go and have a look on Patreon if you're unsure, but just reach a place where you are certain one way or the other what side you are on of the fence. and then let's see where that goes. I'm going to be concluding this episode with a lovely quote from someone from Sotheby's ahead of an exhibition in 2015 from this Allée des Alyscamps. So, and you can just hear how he talks about Van Gogh's art as being filled with joy, not misery, and not self-doubt, and not all that kind of thing. And that is what attracts art collectors to his work. So I'm going to play that, and then I'm also going to play you an extended version of what Van Gogh says to Dr. Ray, and see what you think about that. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to this channel, and I will see you guys next time.
Then you get hysterical, out of control, and yes, one night you cut off one of your ears. Can you tell me why?
My friend was about to leave me. He was about to leave.
And cutting one of your ears was a way to keep him next to you? That doesn't make sense. Was it a kind of gift or a sacrifice or what? What were you trying to achieve?
I don't know.
Might help to talk about it. Try to tell me. I've never seen anything like this before. But I'd like to help you.
There's something inside me. I don't know what it is. What I see, nobody else sees, and sometimes it frightens me. I think I'm losing my mind. But then I say to myself, I'll show what I see to my human brothers who can't see it. It's a privilege. I can give them hope and consolation.
You're confusing people. You're confusing yourself with your paintings.
It is the emotion, the joy, the exuberance, the sense of being alive that so excites collectors. It is a product both of a highly emotional sensibility as well as a very intellectual one.